Miss Marple had never been one for theatrics, but there was something undeniably dramatic about a locked room and a man found dead inside it. The news had travelled quickly through St. Mary Mead. An artist, Henry Ashworth, discovered in his study, slumped over his desk, a look of profound surprise frozen on his face. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows latched, and yet, somehow, someone had managed to kill him. It was the portrait that made it strange. Among the paintings that cluttered the small, dimly lit room, landscapes, still lifes, portraits of noble women with unreadable expressions, one stood out. A small, forgotten portrait, covered in dust, had been placed deliberately on his desk. It was an oil painting of a woman, her face half shrouded in shadow. No one recognized her. The police, naturally, were baffled. There was no sign of forced entry. The servant who found him, young Alice Harper, swore she had been just outside in the hallway when she heard nothing but the scratch of Ashworth's pen against paper. When she knocked and received no response, she fetched the housekeeper, who, upon breaking down the door, discovered the artist quite dead. The only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of a clock. Miss Marple, ever observant, arrived with the innocent pretense of a visit. She listened carefully, nodding in all the right places, and let her eyes roam the room. Poison was ruled out. No visible wounds, no sign of struggle, just the portrait and the peculiar arrangement of objects on Ashworth's desk. A single letter, half-written, the ink still glistening. The forgotten portrait nagged at her. Why had it been placed there deliberately, as if left to be found? What was its significance? The answer, she knew, lay in the past, secrets buried under years of dust and deception. Miss Marple did not believe in accidents. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the study, knitting in hand, though her mind was far from her stitches. The room still bore the hush of death, the air thick with the scent of oil paints and old paper. Inspector Craddock, a capable enough man but prone to overlooking the subtleties of human nature, moved about the space with a notepad, scribbling observations that, to Miss Marple's mind, missed the heart of the matter. He was focused on the mechanics, the locked door, the windows, the absence of a murder weapon. She, however, was watching the people. Alice Harper, the maid who had discovered Ashworth's body, stood with her hands clasped tightly before her, eyes darting nervously to the portrait on the desk. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fanshawe, had the look of a woman who had seen tragedy before, but never quite gotten used to it. And then there was Stephen Rathbone, a younger artist who had been Ashworth's protégé, his expression tight, a gloved hand gripping the back of a chair as though to steady himself. Craddock cleared his throat. The door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry, no weapon, no obvious wounds. He spoke in the clipped tones of a man outlining an enigma. Yet Mr. Ashworth is quite dead. Miss Marple let her needles click together softly. You said there was a letter on the desk. Craddock nodded, flipping back a page in his notebook. Yes, unfinished. My dearest, and then a few words that make little sense. Too late now, you must... And then it trails off, as if interrupted. Miss Marple's gaze fell once more on the portrait, its dusty frame at odds with the carefully arranged clutter of Ashworth's workspace. A forgotten painting, yet here it was, placed purposefully where all would see it. She leaned forward, adjusting her spectacles, and took in the details. The woman's dark eyes, her solemn mouth, the odd way the light fell across her cheek, highlighting the edge of a delicate gold necklace. That portrait, she murmured. Does anyone know who she is? Stephen Rathbone exhaled sharply, drawing all eyes to him. No, he said too quickly. Henry never spoke of it. Just an old painting, I suppose. Miss Marple's fingers stilled. A peculiar answer, given that artists rarely kept work they considered unimportant. Before she could press further, Inspector Craddock cut in. Well, let's focus on what we do know. The last person to see Mr. Ashworth alive was young Alice here, he said, nodding toward the maid. You heard no one enter the room? Alice swallowed, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her apron. No, sir. I brought him his tea at 8:30, just like always. He seemed preoccupied, sir. Didn't even look at me, just waved a hand. She hesitated, and he locked the door behind me. Alice, Miss Marple said gently, what made you knock later? The girl looked startled, as though she hadn't expected to be addressed. Well, miss, it was the sound of the clock, you see. It chimed 9, but I thought I'd heard it already. Twice, like an echo, Miss Marple's lips pressed together. An echo, or something else entirely. Craddock dismissed it with a wave. Likely your imagination, given the shock. Miss Marple, however, was not so quick to dismiss the oddity. Instead, she turned her attention to the desk once more. There was something that did not belong. The ink pot, the half-written letter, the overturned chair, all expected in a scene of sudden distress. But a faint smudge of oil paint on the letter's edge caught her attention. She leaned in, peering closely. The paint was fresh, and there, beside the ink pot, lay a small brush, hastily wiped clean. She looked up, eyes keen behind her glasses. Inspector, did Mr. Ashworth often paint at night? Craddock blinked. I wouldn't know. Why? Because someone did. That brush was used recently, and yet Mr. Ashworth had no fresh paint on his hands. If he was writing, why was his brush still wet? A silence settled over the room. Stephen Rathbone shifted uneasily, and Alice bit her lip. Miss Marple could feel the shape of something forming, like the first pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Someone had been in this room after all. Someone who had wanted to ensure that portrait was noticed. Someone who had made a fatal mistake. Miss Marple's keen eyes lingered on the smudge of fresh paint, the misplaced brush. Small things, easily overlooked, yet together they whispered. Of a deception carefully arranged, but not carefully enough. Inspector Craddock, frowning, turned to the small group in the study. Right then, let's hear it properly. We need to know everyone's whereabouts last night, from the moment Mr. Ashworth was last seen alive. Stephen Rathbone straightened, his shoulders squared in forced nonchalance. I left before 8, he said. Henry had been in one of his moods, tetchy, withdrawn. Said he wanted to work alone. I took the hint. You were here all day before that? Most of it, Rathbone admitted, shifting his weight. We'd been going through some of his older paintings. He wanted to get rid of a few, make space in the studio. That's when I saw the portrait. First time I'd ever noticed it, but Henry brushed it off when I asked. Just said it was a mistake, a commission he never delivered. A mistake? Miss Marple repeated softly. Stephen hesitated. Well, that's what he said. But he looked uneasy, like he wished I hadn't noticed it at all. Miss Marple tapped her fingers against her knitting needles. A commission never delivered. A painting that unnerved even its creator. But if Henry Ashworth had truly wanted to forget it, why place it so deliberately on his desk in death? Craddock made a note, then turned to Mrs. Fanshawe, the housekeeper. And you? She nodded solemnly. I went to my room just after supper, read a bit. Heard nothing out of the ordinary till Alice called me. Alice, still wringing her hands, spoke next. I swear I never saw no one go in after I brought his tea, sir, and I was right outside dusting the banisters most of the time. Most of the time? Alice's cheeks flushed. Well, I did go down to the kitchen for a bit. Mrs. Fanshawe asked me to fetch some sugar. She turned to the older woman. You remember, Mum? The housekeeper gave a tight nod. I do. Craddock scribbled something in his notebook, his expression unreadable. So, from the moment Alice left the tea, to the moment she knocked and got no answer. That leaves a small window of opportunity, and if the door was locked from the inside, then either the killer was already in the room or Mr. Ashworth locked it himself, unaware of the danger. Miss Marple murmured. Silence. It was Rathbone who broke it, rubbing the back of his neck. If you ask me, he said, glancing at the portrait, this whole thing has something to do with that painting. Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. Perhaps it does. And yet, Mr. Rathbone, when I asked earlier if you recognized the woman, you said, no. Quite emphatically, in fact. And now you suggest it holds the key to his death. Which is it? A flicker of something passed over his face. Annoyance? Guilt? He exhaled sharply. I told you. Henry never talked about it. It's a feeling, that's all. A very sudden feeling, Miss Marple noted. His jaw tightened. You think I had something to do with this? I think, she said, her voice mild, that you know more than you're saying. The atmosphere in the room grew taut. Even Alice had gone still, eyes darting between them. Craddock's gaze lingered on Rathbone for a moment before he shifted his attention. Well, someone's lying. That much is clear. Maybe not about the murder itself, but about something. He snapped his notebook shut. Mr. Rathbone, you're staying in the village, I presume? Stephen nodded stiffly. Good, don't go anywhere. He didn't reply, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. As Craddock turned back to the housekeeper and Alice, Miss Marple's attention drifted once more to the portrait. A commission never delivered. A mistake. Henry Ashworth had looked uneasy at its mention. Yet someone had wanted it seen. And if that someone had taken care to wipe paint from a brush, but left a smudge behind, then perhaps last night Henry Ashworth had painted something new. Something that had sealed his fate. Miss Marple sat quietly, the rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles the only sound filling the study. Though she appeared absorbed in her work, her mind was untangling the delicate threads of deception, each observation forming a pattern beneath her practiced eye. Inspector Craddock, pacing by the desk, seemed less inclined toward patience. We have too many loose ends, he muttered. If Rathbone is lying about the portrait, why? If Ashworth feared it, why put it on display? And if this was murder, why a locked room? He shook his head. It's a mess. Miss Marple gave him a placid, look. It's a puzzle, Inspector. And like all puzzles, it has a solution. The difficulty is not in the lack of pieces, but in arranging them correctly. Craddock sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. All right, let's go through it again.
Motives. Someone wanted Ashworth dead, and that portrait, it meant something.
He flipped through his notes. Rathbone. Closest thing Ashworth had to an apprentice. Young, ambitious, but not particularly wealthy. If Ashworth was standing in his way, that could be a motive. Miss Marple nodded but said nothing. Ambition could drive a man to desperate acts, But Stephen Rathbone had not struck her as desperate. Restless, yes, hiding something, certainly. But murder. Craddock moved on. Mrs. Fanshawe, long-time housekeeper, loyal, but maybe too loyal. What if she knew something about Ashworth's past? Something damaging? He tapped his fingers against his notebook. Or maybe she knew who the woman in the portrait was. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to Mrs. Fanshawe, who was speaking quietly with Alice by the doorway. The housekeeper was composed, but beneath her calm exterior was a woman accustomed to keeping secrets. Craddock continued, "And Alice, the maid, wrong. Place, wrong time, or something more." He frowned. She heard something odd, that business about the clock chiming twice, and she left her post at just the right moment for someone to slip inside unseen. Convenient, isn't it? Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. Alice Harper was a timid thing, but fear could drive even the meekest of souls to desperate measures. Was she lying to protect herself? Or someone else? The inspector huffed. Too many motives, too many gaps. We need to speak to Rathbone again. He knows something. But Miss Marple, still gazing at the portrait, murmured, "Before we do, Inspector, tell me, do you believe in ghosts?" Craddock looked at her, startled. "Of course not." "Neither do I," she said. "And yet that portrait is a ghost of sorts, isn't it? A ghost of something unfinished. A mistake, as Mr. Rathbone called it. But whose mistake?" Craddock frowned. "Ashworth's." "Perhaps," she mused. "Or perhaps it belonged to someone else." "Entirely." She set her knitting aside and rose. "I should like to see Mr. Ashworth's studio." Craddock hesitated, then gestured toward the adjoining door. "Be my guest." The studio was as she expected. Dust motes drifting through shafts of pale morning light, canvases stacked against the walls, half-finished work staring out from their frames. But it was the easel in the center of the room that caught her attention. The canvas was blank, but the floor beneath it was speckled with fresh paint. Someone had been working here recently. Miss Marple bent down, running a gloved finger lightly across the faint smear of colour, the same shade of deep umber she had seen smudged on the letter, the same shade used in the forgotten portrait. She straightened, glancing at Craddock. "Inspector, I believe Mr. Ashworth was painting something last night. Something he did not want others to see." Craddock exhaled sharply. "Then where is it?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "That, my dear Inspector, is precisely what we must find out." Inspector Craddock's voice carried through the study with a note of triumph. "Well, Miss Marple, it seems we have our answer." He held up a small canvas, pulled moments ago from behind a stack of older paintings in Henry Ashworth's studio. The paint was still tacky, the brushstrokes hurried, but the image was unmistakable. A crude but recognizable recreation of the woman in the forgotten portrait. Stephen Rathbone, standing by the fireplace, paled. "Where did you find that?" "In the studio," Craddock said. "Hidden, but not well enough. Which means Ashworth was repainting her last night, and since we know he died shortly after, we have to ask, why?" Rathbone swallowed hard, his gaze flicking toward the painting, then away. Craddock turned to Alice. "You brought his tea at 8:30, and you swear he was alone?" Alice nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. He barely looked at me." Miss Marple, watching the scene unfold, remained silent, her fingers lightly resting on the arm of her chair. There was a rush to conclusions happening before her, a puzzle being solved too neatly. Craddock continued. The way I see it, Ashworth was trying to recreate a painting he once destroyed or lost. Maybe someone didn't want him to finish it. Maybe someone killed him for it. He turned sharply toward Rathbone. And you, Mr. Rathbone, had the most to lose if he was painting something that could ruin him. Rathbone's mouth tightened. That's ridiculous. Is it? Craddock pressed. You were his closest confidant. You saw the portrait yesterday, asked about it, and suddenly Ashworth is dead. And this, he gestured to the painting, is hidden in his studio. Rathbone's hands clenched into fists. I didn't kill him. Craddock crossed his arms. Then explain why you were so rattled earlier when Miss Marple mentioned the painting. Explain why you claimed not to recognize the woman, yet now look like you've seen a ghost. Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice mild but firm. I think Mr. Rathbone is afraid, but not of being caught for murder. All eyes turned to her. She gestured toward the fresh painting. This, Inspector, is a copy of something Ashworth had already painted. The original was what mattered. This was a memory, a desperate attempt to recreate what had been lost. And I think, Inspector, you will find that the original painting is missing. Craddock blinked. You think the killer took it? Miss Marple gave him a small smile. I think, Inspector, that this was never about murder alone. This was about erasing something that someone did not want to be seen. Craddock frowned. And yet Ashworth's attempt to recreate it suggests he still remembered. So if the killer stole the painting, they failed to erase the truth entirely. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. But the question remains, what was so dangerous about this portrait? Stephen Rathbone inhaled deeply as if steadying himself. You said it yourself, Miss Marple. A ghost. She studied him closely. A ghost of whose past? Mr. Rathbone. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a look of resignation, he murmured, Henry never told me the full story, but I think the woman in that portrait was supposed to be dead. A sharp silence followed. Mrs. Fanshawe paled, and Alice let out a small gasp. Craddock's grip tightened on his notebook. Miss Marple simply nodded, as though she had expected as much. Then, Inspector, she said gently, I believe you will find that our mystery is not yet solved at all. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her eyes resting on the painting with quiet intensity. The woman's face, though hastily recreated, held a ghostly familiarity, as if she were a presence lingering just beyond the edges of memory. Henry Ashworth had tried to bring her back, not just to canvas, but to reality. And someone had killed him for it. Inspector Craddock flipped through his notebook, muttering under his breath, A woman who was supposed to be dead. What does that mean? Who was she? He looked up at Stephen Rathbone. You said Ashworth never told you the full story, but he must have said something. Rathbone hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the fireplace mantel. Not directly, but years ago, I remember him mentioning a scandal, something that nearly ruined him when he was younger. It was before I knew him, before he became reclusive. I never pressed him for details, but I think it involved a woman, a model, perhaps. Someone he painted and then lost. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Lost, she repeated, her tone delicate but probing. Rathbone swallowed. Disappeared. Or, so he said. A heavy silence settled over the room. Mrs. Fanshawe, standing near the window, had gone pale. Miss Marple turned to her, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Fanshawe, dear, you have worked for Mr. Ashworth longer than anyone. Would you happen to know anything?" "About this woman?" The housekeeper's hands twisted in her apron. I don't know," she whispered. Craddock's gaze sharpened. "Mrs. Fanshawe, if you know something, now is the time to say it." The woman swallowed, then sighed, as if surrendering to something long buried. "I wasn't always his housekeeper," she admitted. "Years ago I worked for another household, a wealthy family in London, the Harcourts." Miss Marple's knitting paused for only a fraction of a second. "The Harcourts?" Mrs. Fanshawe nodded. "Yes, and there was a daughter, Margaret." Stephen Rathbone inhaled sharply. "Margaret Harcourt, the one who—" Mrs. Fanshawe nodded gravely. "The one who vanished." Craddock's brows furrowed. "I know the case," he said slowly. "Margaret Harcourt was engaged to some society gentleman, Marcus Weatherby, I believe. Then one day she disappeared without a trace. There were whispers, of course. Some thought she ran away, others suspected worse." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting. "And Henry Ashworth painted her." Mrs. Fanshawe closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of it were too much. "He did. He adored her, though no one was supposed to know. They were involved, in secret, and then suddenly she was gone." Craddock's expression darkened. "Are you saying Ashworth was a suspect?" Mrs. Fanshawe shook her head. "Not officially. The Harcourts never pursued it. Too much scandal. But there were whispers, Inspector. And Henry, he was never the same." After that, Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly, arranging the pieces of the puzzle. A woman who disappeared, a painter who tried to forget. And now, after all these years, the same woman's image reappeared, and Henry Ashworth was dead. She turned back to the painting, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone was afraid Margaret Harcourt would come back." Craddock exhaled. "Which means she never really died, did she?" Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "Or someone wanted the world to believe she had." A new, chilling silence settled over the room. Somewhere, in the past, lay the true reason Henry Ashworth had been killed. And now, with his murder, the past had come clawing its way back into the present. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their delicate work with the knitting needles, though her mind was wholly absorbed in the puzzle before her. The Harcourt scandal, a woman vanished, a painter haunted by her memory. These were the echoes of an old tragedy. But it was not the past alone that had claimed Henry Ashworth's life. Someone had acted in the present to ensure a secret remained buried. Inspector Craddock exhaled sharply, rubbing his chin. If Margaret Harcourt never truly disappeared, then where has she been all these years? And why now, of all times, would Ashworth try to paint her again? Stephen Rathbone, still standing stiffly by the fireplace, said, Unless he knew where she was, or someone told him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet approval. "An excellent thought, Mr. Rathbone. But if Henry Ashworth was attempting to bring Margaret's image back into the light, we must ask, who would have wanted to stop him?" Craddock turned to Mrs. Fanshawe, who was still wringing her hands. "Mrs. Fanshawe, when did you last see Margaret Harcourt? And I mean truly see her, with your own eyes?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Not since the day she vanished. But I heard whispers years later that she had been sent away. For her own good, they said." Miss Marple's needles clicked in a steady rhythm. "Sent away. How very interesting." Craddock frowned. You think someone arranged for her disappearance? Miss Marple gave a small smile. I think, Inspector, that if someone truly wished to disappear, they might do so very convincingly. But if they were forced into it, well, then the secret belongs to whoever forced them. The room was heavy with thought. Then Miss Marple's expression brightened with a sudden notion. She turned to Alice, the timid maid who had been lingering near the doorway. My dear, I wonder, what time does the morning post usually arrive? Alice blinked. The post, ma'am? Yes, the post. I imagine Mr. Ashworth received letters, and at his age likely had correspondence of long acquaintance. Alice nodded. It comes at 8, ma'am, just before I take up the breakfast tray. Miss Marple turned to Craddock. I should like very much to see Mr. Ashworth's correspondence from yesterday morning. Craddock hesitated for only a moment, before motioning to a constable. Fetch any letters that arrived yesterday. If Miss Marple thinks they're important, I'd rather not overlook them. Minutes later, a stack of envelopes was placed before them. Most were routine, bills, an invitation to an art exhibit, but one letter, slightly crumpled and marked with a hastily torn seal, caught Miss Marple's eye. She unfolded the page and read aloud. Henry, you are a fool to dig up ghosts. Some things should remain buried. You know what happened last time. Do not force my hand again. Silence thickened the air. Craddock muttered, No signature. Miss Marple tapped the paper lightly. No, but a warning nonetheless, and an urgent one. What happened last time, it says, which means whoever wrote this has acted before. Rathbone's voice was tight. Then we aren't looking for just a murderer. We're looking for someone who has been hiding the truth for decades. Craddock looked at Miss Marple. How do we find them? Miss Marple smiled serenely. By giving them the chance to betray themselves, of course. There was a quiet confidence in her voice that unsettled even Craddock, though he had long since learned to trust her instincts. She folded the letter carefully and stood. I believe it's time for a small deception of our own. An hour later, the household was gathered in the drawing-room. Mrs. Fanshawe, Rathbone, Alice, and even Dr. Everley, the late Mr. Ashworth's physician, who had been asked to return on an urgent matter. Miss Marple sat comfortably, knitting, as she spoke. I have received some very interesting news, she said, her voice light but firm. A woman has come forward claiming to be Margaret Harcourt. She is waiting in town to speak to the authorities. A sharp intake of breath, a flicker of fear in Mrs. Fanshawe's eyes. Dr. Everley, usually calm, stiffened in his chair. That's impossible, he said too quickly. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm. Impossible, she repeated mildly. How curious that you would think so, Doctor. Everley hesitated, his gaze darting between the others in the room. I only mean, after all these years, it's unlikely she would return now. Miss Marple studied him with quiet intensity. Unless, of course, she was never truly gone. The room was silent. Then from Mrs. Fanshawe a soft, broken whisper. She was afraid. All eyes turned to her. She looked pale, her hands trembling. She never disappeared on her own, she admitted. She was sent away, locked away. Craddock leaned forward. By whom? Mrs. Fanshawe's lips parted, but before she could speak, Dr. Everley stood abruptly. That's enough, he snapped. This is all nonsense. Miss Marple's knitting stopped. Her eyes met his. Is it? Dr. Everley's face was flushed. His hands clenched at his sides. You have no proof of any of this. Craddock rose slowly, No? Then tell me, Doctor, why are you sweating? The question hung in the air. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unyielding. Margaret Harcourt was not meant to be found, was she, Doctor? Dr. Everly swallowed hard, his composure unravelling. You don't understand. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Oh, but I do, and I believe you understand it even better. After all, you have spent so many years ensuring that she remained forgotten. A tense silence filled the drawing room, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling like an unseen force over the gathered company. Dr. Everly's hands trembled ever so slightly, a sheen of perspiration glistening at his brow. Craddock folded, his arms, his eyes fixed on the doctor. You've been keeping secrets, Everly. What exactly have you been hiding about Margaret Harcourt? Everly's jaw tightened. This is absurd. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. Miss Marple tilted, her head watching him with the same patience she afforded her knitting. No, not the disappearance itself, perhaps. But you knew where she was, didn't you? His mouth opened, but no words came. The others were staring at him now, Mrs. Fanshawe clutching her apron, Rathbone standing rigid, Alice shrinking back. Then, a sound from the hallway, a sharp, sudden noise, a heavy thud, followed by the distinct shattering of glass. Craddock reacted first, striding to the door, but Miss Marple was not far behind. The group moved as one, following the sound down the corridor to Henry Ashworth's study. The door was ajar. Inside, a lamp lay on its side, its base broken into jagged pieces. And in the centre of the desk, where the late artist's scattered letters had once been, there was now only empty space. Craddock cursed under his breath. The letters. Someone's taken them. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a rare display of displeasure. Not just taken, Inspector, stolen in haste. The constable who had been posted outside came hurrying in, his face red with alarm. No one passed through the front door, sir. Whoever did this is still inside. Craddock turned sharply. Then we have a thief among us. He faced the gathered witnesses, his gaze sweeping over each one. Alice, wide-eyed and frightened, Mrs. Fanshawe shaking, Rathbone, his face drawn, and Everly, whose hands were now balled into fists. Miss Marple's keen gaze softened. You see, dear Inspector, when the truth is on the verge of being revealed, those most desperate will risk everything to keep it hidden. Craddock's eyes darkened. And I intend to find out who, that is. Miss Marple moved toward the desk, her fingers lightly tracing the surface. The thief was not concerned with making it look like a burglary. They were only interested in silencing the past. Craddock turned to the constable. Search every room, every coat pocket, every drawer. The letters must still be in the house. As the constables fanned out, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the broken lamp. She knelt carefully, examining the shards. This was knocked over in haste, but not entirely by accident. Rathbone's voice was hushed. You think someone wanted us to hear? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps, or perhaps they wished to make us believe something had been taken, when in fact the real evidence remains hidden in plain sight. Craddock's mouth tightened. Then the question is, what was the thief truly after? A flicker of movement in the hallway, a shadow retreating. Miss Marple noticed it first. Without a word, she straightened and moved swiftly in its direction, her small, sure steps deceptively quick. Craddock followed, his hand hovering near his revolver. They reached the back of the house, where the study's fireplace opened into an old servant's passageway. The air smelled faintly of soot and dust. And there, standing just beyond the flickering gaslight, was Alice. The maid started when she saw them, her hands clutching the folds of her skirt. Craddock's voice was firm. "Alice, what are you doing here?" Her lips parted, but she seemed unable to form words. Her hands trembled, and then, as if unable to bear it any longer, she withdrew something from her apron pocket. A single folded letter. Miss Marple took it, gently unfolding the worn page. It was one of Henry Ashworth's letters, the same peculiar, hurried script. But it was not addressed to him. It was from him. Craddock peered over her shoulder. His breath caught. "Margaret, I have waited too long. They will never let you return. But I cannot live with the silence any longer. If you are alive, I must see you. If you receive this, meet me. I will keep you safe this time." The date was recent. Miss Marple turned to Alice, her voice impossibly kind. "You took this from the study, didn't you, dear?" Alice swallowed hard. I didn't mean to steal it. I saw the letters, and when I read this one, I knew it was important. I was afraid someone else would take it first." Craddock's voice was gruff but not unkind. "Did you see who ransacked the study just now?" She shook her head rapidly. "No, I heard footsteps and got scared. I hid in the passage." Miss Marple's fingers smoothed over the letter thoughtfully. "Then we must ask, Inspector. If Henry Ashworth sent this letter, who received it?" Craddock exhaled sharply. If Margaret Harcourt was alive, and Ashworth had contacted her, Miss Marple nodded, then she may have been closer than we ever imagined. The house had grown eerily still. Somewhere within its walls, someone was watching, listening. And someone had just risked everything to keep the truth from emerging. But the truth had a way of surviving, even when buried beneath the weight of time. A distant crash shattered the tense silence, followed by the sharp clang of something metallic striking the floor. Miss Marple's head snapped toward the source of the sound, somewhere beyond the main hall, in the direction of the servants' quarters. Craddock was already moving, his footsteps echoing through the dimly lit corridors. Alice let out a strangled gasp and shrank back against the wall, eyes wide with fright. Miss Marple, despite her frail appearance, followed at a brisk pace. The constables who had been scouring the house for the stolen letters converged toward the commotion. Craddock reached the heavy wooden door that led to the servants' wing and pushed it open. The passage smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the gas lamps flickering against the dark wallpaper. Another sound, a muffled cry, made them move faster. At the end of the corridor, just outside a narrow door leading to the back stairwell, lay a crumpled form. Dr. Everley. His white coat was streaked with blood, a fresh gash marring his temple. A silver candlestick lay nearby, its base stained red. He groaned softly, one hand twitching toward his head. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her gentle touch surprisingly steady as she examined his injury. "He's alive," she murmured. "But someone didn't want him speaking to us again." Craddock turned sharply to the constables. "Search the wing. Whoever did this can't have gone far." The men scattered, doors opening and slamming shut as they moved through the quarters. Miss Marple, meanwhile, peered down at Everley's hands. A faint smudge of ink marked his fingertips. "Dr. Everley," she said softly, pressing a handkerchief to his wound. "You were writing something, weren't you?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused for a moment before he let out a weak, bitter laugh. I was going to confess something," he croaked. "But they found me first." Craddock crouched beside him. Who attacked you?" Everly let out a shallow breath. "I didn't see, but I know why." His fingers twitched, as though trying to grasp at something. "The truth. It's buried deeper than you think." His gaze flickered toward Miss Marple, something like regret darkening his eyes. "I should have come forward sooner." Craddock's frustration showed in his clenched jaw. "We'll get you patched up. But tell us, was this about Margaret Harcourt?" Flicker of something crossed Everly's face. Then with an effort he nodded. "Yes, and Henry. It was never just about her." Miss Marple glanced at Craddock. "Inspector, I believe we are dealing with someone who is growing desperate. This was no mere warning. Dr. Everly was nearly killed because he knew too much." Craddock rose to his feet. "Then we're running out of time." A constable reappeared at the far end of the hall, breathless. "No sign of the attacker, sir, but there's something you should see in the kitchen." Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged glances before following the constable through a side door. The kitchen was eerily empty, the long wooden table set for the evening supper. But at the far end of the room, near the back door, a small, soot-covered envelope lay discarded on the floor. Miss Marple bent to pick it up, her fingers barely brushing the parchment before she froze. The wax seal bore an insignia, a crest she had not seen in many years. The Ashworth family crest. She carefully pried it open. Inside was a letter, hurriedly scrawled, but unmistakably written by Henry Ashworth. "The walls are closing in. I have made a terrible mistake. If you are reading this, then I am already gone. The past is not finished with us yet." Miss Marple inhaled sharply. Craddock read over her shoulder, his expression dark. This was written before his death. He knew something was coming. She nodded gravely. "And whoever silenced him isn't finished yet." The realization settled over them like a storm cloud. They were no longer just solving a crime, they were trying to stop another one before it was too late. Miss Marple held the letter carefully, her sharp eyes scanning the hurried strokes of Henry Ashworth's final words. "The past is not finished with us yet." The weight of those words settled in her mind as she glanced toward the soot-stained envelope. Something about it tugged at her memory, not just the crest, but the smudges, the way the letter had been left behind. It was deliberate, not discarded in haste, but placed where it would be found. Craddock, pacing beside her, exhaled sharply. "We have Everly attacked, a letter from Henry warning of his own demise, and a missing killer still lurking in this house. None of this is coincidental." Miss Marple's fingers traced the edges of the envelope as she turned to the constables. "Inspector, do you recall where the stolen letters were last seen before they vanished?" "The study," Craddock said at once. "Locked drawer, forced open." "And yet," she murmured, "this letter was not taken." She set it down on the kitchen table, pressing a gentle finger to the soot stains. "This house has several chimneys, yes? And the study, does it have a fireplace?" Craddock frowned. "It does. The thief who took the other letters was not careless, but this one was meant to be found. And if I am not mistaken," she turned the envelope over and brought it close to the gaslight. There, faint but visible, were the remnants of burned edges. Craddock swore under his breath. "They tried to destroy it. Miss Marple gave a small nod, and were interrupted. A slow understanding dawned in her expression as she traced the pattern in her mind. Something had been bothering her for some time, a detail that had seemed irrelevant, almost laughably small, and yet... She turned back to the letter, Henry's warning echoing in her thoughts. The past is not finished with us yet. Margaret Harcourt had been the initial victim, but Henry's death had changed everything. And then there was Everleigh, attacked just when he had decided to confess something. The assailant wasn't merely reacting, they were trying to control what was known. The destruction of evidence, the stolen letters, the attempts to silence those who might know the truth. Her gaze drifted to Alice, who still hovered near the doorway, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. The young woman had been the first to find Margaret, had heard the broken whisper of her last words. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Alice, my dear, may I trouble you for something? When you first found poor Miss Harcourt, you said she muttered something before she passed. Tell me once more, as exactly as you can recall." Alice swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Craddock, before returning to Miss Marple. I think she said portrait. At least that's what it sounded like. It didn't make sense." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Oh, but I do believe it makes quite a great deal of sense." She straightened, her blue eyes glittering with sudden certainty. "Inspector, I believe we have been looking at this case the wrong way round. The answer has been before us this entire time, only we have been too distracted to see it." Craddock folded his arms, studying her with keen interest. "Go on." Miss Marple glanced at the soot-streaked letter once more before turning toward the grand hall, her voice quiet but firm. "The answer lies in a portrait, one that someone does not wish us to see." Craddock's brows furrowed, but he followed her lead. The other constables hesitated only a moment before falling in step behind them. The portraits in the Ashworth estate lined the grand staircase and various drawing rooms, a testament to the family's long lineage. But Miss Marple did not stop at the well-maintained paintings of past generations. Instead, she walked with careful steps toward a less obvious place, the east wing, where dust had settled thicker, where the furniture was draped in white sheets. "The family quarters," Craddock muttered. "No one goes in here any more." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, then lifted toward the fireplace. And there, hanging above it, was a portrait that did not belong. The frame was different, less ornate than the others, as though it had been replaced. The painting itself, though well done, seemed newer, and most telling of all, there were faint smudges along the bottom edge. Someone had touched it. Miss Marple stepped forward and, without hesitation, reached up to lift the portrait from the wall. The moment she did, a gust of cold air rushed from behind it. Craddock cursed under his breath as a concealed compartment was revealed. Inside, nestled in the darkness, were a collection of aged letters, a small silver key, and an object wrapped in faded cloth. Gingerly, Miss Marple unwrapped it. What she held in her hands was unmistakable, a miniature portrait far older than the one on the wall, but the face staring back at her was eerily familiar. Craddock inhaled sharply. "Good Lord!" Miss Marple turned the small portrait over, her expression unreadable. There, inscribed on the back, was a name that tied everything together. The past had not been finished after all. It had merely been waiting to be found. Miss Marple turned the miniature portrait over in her hands, the candlelight flickering across its delicate surface. The face staring back at her was hauntingly familiar, yet altered by the passage of time. The name inscribed on the back sent a shiver of certainty through her. She had suspected the past played a larger role in this crime, but now the truth was coming into focus. Craddock leaned closer, reading the inscription aloud. Eleanor Ashworth, 1872. But that... His eyes flickered to the larger, more recent portrait that had concealed this one. This doesn't make sense. The Eleanor Ashworth in the family records died in infancy. She wasn't supposed to have lived long enough for a portrait to be made. Miss Marple's voice was steady. And yet here she is. Silence settled over the room as the weight of that realization pressed upon them. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase this Eleanor from history. A missing heir, a buried scandal. The possibilities unfurled in Miss Marple's mind, but one thing was certain: this was at the heart of the case. She turned the portrait back toward the assembled group, her sharp gaze resting on Alice. The young woman had paled considerably, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "Alice, my dear, I wonder if you might tell me something." Alice's lips parted as though to protest, but Miss Marple continued gently. "This woman, Eleanor Ashworth, does she remind you of anyone?" Alice's breath hitched, her gaze flickering between the portrait and the room, as though searching for an escape. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but there was steel behind it. "You do, my dear. The resemblance is unmistakable." She turned to Craddock. "Tell me, Inspector, who in this house does she remind you of?" Craddock studied the portrait again, then exhaled sharply. "Good Lord!" His eyes snapped to Alice. "It's you!" The room seemed to shrink around them. Alice took a step back, shaking her head. "No, that's not... I don't know why. She looks like me." Miss Marple gave a small nod, her tone thoughtful. "You have lived here for years, haven't you? Raised in this house, always near the Ashworths, but never quite one of them. And yet, Alice, you have always belonged here in a way no one realized." Alice's hands trembled. "That's not true." "It is," Miss Marple said gently. "Eleanor Ashworth did not die in infancy. She lived. She had children. And somewhere along the line, her existence was erased from history. But bloodlines do not lie." Craddock's voice hardened. "So you were the rightful heir." Alice's expression contorted, grief, anger, something deeper than either. "No," she whispered. "I never wanted any of that. I only wanted the truth." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And so you searched. The stolen letters, the missing documents, they were all pieces of a puzzle you were trying to put together, weren't they?" Alice's breath was ragged. "Yes." Craddock's jaw tightened. "But Henry was killed. Miss Harcourt was murdered. Were they part of your truth-seeking as well?" Alice's head jerked up, eyes wide with shock. "No, I swear I had nothing to do with that." "I thought—" She hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. "I thought Henry was going to help me. He knew something, but before he could tell me, he was dead." Miss Marple studied her closely. The fear in her voice was genuine, but that did not mean she was innocent in all of this. "Alice," she said gently, "who else knew what you were looking for?" Alice swallowed hard. Only one person, The one who tried to stop me. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with understanding. And that person is still here, still trying to control what is known and what is buried. Craddock tensed. Are you saying the murderer isn't done yet? Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. No, Inspector. The murderer is watching us, at this very moment. A breathless silence fell over the room as Miss Marple turned toward the doorway. And there, standing in the shadows, was the last person they had overlooked. The true villain had been among them all along. Miss Marple's sharp eyes settled on the figure standing in the doorway, half hidden by the heavy drapes. The air in the room thickened with the weight of unspoken truths. Craddock shifted, his hand twitching toward his pocket, but Miss Marple merely folded her hands in front of her, composed as ever. Mr. Redfern, she said softly. The solicitor hesitated, then stepped fully into the light. His face was ashen, but his expression was carefully controlled, the mask of a man who had spent years concealing more than just legal documents. His gaze flickered over Alice, then Craddock, calculating, searching for a way out. I suppose, he said at last, his voice measured. You are about to make an accusation, Miss Marple. She inclined her head slightly. Not an accusation. Mr. Redfern, a conclusion, and I believe you have been expecting it. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth at odds with the chill seeping into the room. No one moved. Craddock's stance was taut, prepared for the moment when the tension might snap into violence. Alice was frozen, her breath quick, her fingers curled against her palms. Redfern exhaled, a slow, almost amused sound. You always struck me as a woman of some intelligence, he said. But this is rather dramatic, isn't it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. It needn't be, Mr. Redfern. But I do wonder, will you attempt to talk your way out of this? Or will you trust that we have pieced together the truth? His jaw twitched. And what truth is that? Miss Marple glanced down at the miniature portrait still resting on the table. The truth that this crime was never about mere inheritance. No, it was something deeper, something older. It was about the fear of exposure. Alice let out a soft breath, barely audible. You knew the Ashworth family history better than anyone, didn't you, Mr. Redfern? Miss Marple continued. As their solicitor, you had access to all their records, their correspondence, even the hidden stains on their name that most had long forgotten. You knew about Eleanor Ashworth, the Eleanor who was erased. Redfern's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, coaxing. And more importantly, you knew that Alice was her descendant, that she had begun to piece together what had been buried. Redfern's fingers curled slightly. And if I did? If you did, Miss Marple said, then you had every reason to be afraid. Because Eleanor Ashworth's true lineage would unravel a web of lies that went far beyond inheritance. It would reveal something else, something you had been keeping hidden for years. Craddock's voice cut in, sharp and sure. Fraud. Redfern's jaw tightened. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. For decades, Mr. Redfern, you have been embezzling from the Ashworth estate, haven't you? A little here, a little there, cleverly. Disguised, of course. No one questioned the records, no one had reason to. Craddock's expression darkened. But if Alice had proven her claim, if she had uncovered the truth about Eleanor, there would have been a full investigation into the Ashworth estate. Every hidden financial thread would have been pulled. Redfern's mask cracked for the first time. "You don't understand," he snapped. Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Oh, but I do." The moment Alice began asking questions, she became a threat. "And Henry, he knew something, didn't he? You realized he might lead her to the truth, and so you silenced him." Alice gasped. "You killed Henry." Redfern's fists clenched. "That fool was prying into things that weren't his concern. Miss Yo," Marple sighed. "And when Miss Harcourt discovered the missing documents, you killed her as well. A woman as meticulous as she was, she must have realized something was amiss." Redfern's breath quickened. "She wasn't supposed to—" He stopped himself, but it was too late. The words had already slipped out. Craddock moved in an instant, stepping forward. "That's enough, Redfern." Redfern's nostrils flared. His gaze darted to the side table, where a heavy brass candlestick rested. A single moment of calculation, then movement. He lunged. But Miss Marple, despite her age, had already anticipated it. She stepped back smoothly, and Craddock intercepted Redfern mid-motion, seizing his arm and twisting him away from the weapon. Redfern struggled, but the fight was brief, his desperation no match for the firm hands of the law. Within moments, Craddock had him restrained. Panting, Redfern slumped, his carefully curated facade shattered. Miss Marple watched him, a touch of sadness in her expression. "Greed, Mr. Redfern," she said softly. "It drives people to do such dreadful things." Alice stared at the man she had once trusted. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You let Henry die, you let Miss Harcourt die. And all for what?" Redfern said nothing. The weight of his actions seemed to press upon him now that there was no escape. Craddock tightened his grip. "You'll answer for all of it." Miss Marple exhaled, folding her hands neatly. "Yes, I do believe this case is finally closed." Craddock tightened the cuffs around Redfern's wrists, the snap of metal punctuating the finality of it all. Alice let out a breath she hadn't realized. She'd been holding, the weight of betrayal heavy in her chest. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows across the room, as though the house itself were exhaling after years of suffocated secrets. Miss Marple, ever composed, watched Redfern carefully. His mask had crumbled, yet something in his expression lingered, something that nagged at her. She had seen relief on the faces of the guilty before, but this was different. Beneath the exhaustion, beneath the resignation, there was something else. Amusement. She stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "There's something you aren't telling us, isn't there, Mr. Redfern?" His lips twitched, almost forming a smirk. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Craddock scowled. "Save it for the judge." He tightened his grip on Redfern's arm, but the man only chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, Inspector, you're terribly eager to close this case, aren't you? But perhaps you should be asking yourself one final question." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. "And what question might that be?" Redfern tilted his head. "Who really stood to gain the most?" A silence settled over the room. Alice frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean? You were embezzling from the estate. You killed Henry and Miss Harcourt to cover your tracks." Redfern's smile didn't fade. "Did I?" Miss Marple felt it then. That subtle shift in the air, that whisper of doubt creeping in. The facts aligned perfectly, yet something remained. Just out of reach, a puzzle piece forced into place when it did not quite fit. A thought struck her like a thunderclap. The letters. She turned sharply to Alice. My dear, the letters you found, remind me, were they in Henry's possession when you arrived? Alice hesitated. No, they were scattered across his desk. And Miss Harcourt's discovery, Miss Marple continued. Her records were taken, her papers disturbed. Someone had rifled through them before she was killed. Craddock frowned. What are you getting at, Miss Marple? She turned back to Redfern, her gaze sharp as a knife. You weren't the one who uncovered Eleanor Ashworth's secret, were you? For the first time, Redfern remained silent. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice barely above a whisper. You weren't the one who found the truth. Someone else did. Someone who needed you as a scapegoat. The answer, when it came, was chilling in its simplicity. Alice. The young woman stiffened as all eyes turned to her. The colour drained from her face, but her breath remained steady. For a fleeting second, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, in the flickering glow of the firelight, Alice let out a slow, shuddering exhale. Oh, she murmured. You really are brilliant, Miss Marple. Craddock stiffened. What the devil? Alice's shoulders relaxed, but her eyes darkened with something unreadable. She turned her gaze toward Redfern, her lips pressing into a thin line. I never thought he'd figure it out, she admitted. But I suppose you were always just a bit too clever, weren't you, Mr. Redfern? Redfern's expression didn't change. I did wonder how long it would take them. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but a steely edge crept into it. It was you, she said softly. You orchestrated everything. Alice tilted her head. Not everything. I didn't kill Henry, if that's what you're asking. Craddock's grip on his revolver tightened. You expect us to believe that? I expect you to listen, Alice said simply. Henry did find the truth first, but I wasn't the only one who knew he was searching. Redfern had been watching him too, hadn't you? Redfern let out a slow breath. I warned him not to dig too deep. Alice continued, her voice steady. Henry was already dead when I arrived. I swear it. But when I saw the letters, when I realized what they meant, I knew it was my only chance. You see, Miss Marple, my claim was legitimate. Eleanor Ashworth was my great-grandmother. But proof? That was harder to come by. Until Henry did the work for me. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And Miss Harcourt. Alice's jaw tensed. She was getting in the way. She found discrepancies in the records. Things that pointed to Redfern, yes, but things that also called my inheritance into question. I couldn't let her expose me. Craddock's face darkened. You... Alice turned toward him, a quiet, unsettling smile playing at the edges of her lips. Do you know what it's like, Inspector? To grow up knowing you come from a family that never wanted you, that erased you? Her fingers clenched at her sides. I had a right to that inheritance, but no one was ever going to give it to me, not unless I made them, Miss Marple sighed. And so you set the stage, you let Redfern take the fall. Alice glanced at Redfern, then back at Miss Marple. I didn't have to do much, did I? He was already guilty of fraud. I just nudged things along. Craddock stepped forward. Alice Redfern, I'm placing you under arrest. But Alice suddenly moved, her hand darting toward the heavy glass paperweight on the desk. Craddock lunged, but Miss Marple was faster. No need for that, my dear, she said gently. Alice hesitated. For one brief moment, the steel in her eyes wavered. Then, as though something within her had finally shattered, she let the paperweight slip from her grasp. Craddock wasted no time. He grabbed her wrist, snapping the cuffs into place. Alice said nothing as he led her toward the door. Miss Marple exhaled. Redfern, still bound, let out a dry chuckle. "Well," he murmured, "I suppose we were both played in the end, Miss—" Marple studied him for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "but you will still answer for your part in this." The fire crackled once more, the room now eerily still. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, indifferent to the weight of the secrets it had borne witness to. Miss Marple folded her hands, her sharp gaze lingering on the remnants of a mystery now unravelled. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, her hands folded neatly over her lap. The flickering flames cast warm, shifting shadows across her serene face, but her sharp blue eyes remained keen, unwavering. The air in the room had shifted, not with relief nor triumph, but with a lingering unease. Justice, as it were, had been dealt, but justice was not always so simple. "Inspector," Craddock, standing near the doorway, exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his tired face. Alice Redfern had been taken away, silent and unreadable until the very end. Redfern himself, though still bound, had finally ceased his smirking. He had played a dangerous game and lost, but the weight of his own guilt was secondary to the betrayal he had suffered. He had believed himself the orchestrator, the mastermind, only to realize he had been nothing more than a pawn. "She nearly got away with it," Craddock muttered, half to himself. "If not for you." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I suspect she always knew she wouldn't get away, Inspector. She was far too clever to truly believe she could erase all suspicion forever." Craddock frowned. "Then why go through with it?" Miss Marple sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Because for Alice, it was never simply about winning. It was about taking control of her story. She had been erased once, Inspector. She would not let that happen again." Craddock shook his head. "She murdered Miss Harcourt in cold blood." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And she will face the consequences for it." There was a beat of silence before Craddock cleared his throat. "I must admit I didn't see it. I thought we had our culprit wrapped up nicely." He shot a glance at Redfern. "You didn't, though. You had doubts." Miss Marple's lips quirked ever so slightly. "Doubt is a wonderful thing, Inspector. It prevents one from settling too comfortably into an assumption." She glanced toward the darkened window, the night outside pressing against the glass like an unspoken whisper. "The truth is often a puzzle, you see. And people, dear Inspector, will always tell you exactly who they are if only you listen." Craddock pulled out a chair, his brow furrowed. "Go on, then. Indulge me. What was it that gave Alice away?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "It wasn't one thing, Inspector. It was everything. But if you must have a starting point, it was the letters." Craddock blinked. "The letters?" "Yes," Miss Marple nodded. "Alice found them on Henry's desk, did she not? That much we know to be true. But tell me, Inspector, why would Henry leave them out so carelessly if he had already discovered their significance? He had begun to suspect he was in danger, and yet his greatest discovery, the very proof of his claims, was scattered across his desk for anyone to see." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple interjected gently, "that Henry never had the chance to hide them. Someone else made sure those letters were seen. Redfern exhaled sharply. Alice, he muttered. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. Henry had discovered the truth, but he had not yet made his move. Alice, however, saw the opportunity. She needed those letters to be found because she needed a motive to frame you, Mr. Redfern. Redfern scoffed. So I was always meant to be the scapegoat. Oh, yes, Miss Marple confirmed. Your fraud made you an easy target. And when Miss Harcourt began asking too many questions, Alice knew she would become an obstacle as well. Craddock muttered a curse under his breath. So she killed Miss Harcourt to keep her quiet, and let us follow the obvious trail to Redfern. Indeed, Miss Marple said. She didn't need to fabricate evidence. She merely needed to let us find the right pieces. Craddock let out a long breath, shaking his head. And yet something still doesn't sit right with me. Miss Marple looked at him curiously. Oh? Craddock leaned forward. You were right about Alice. I see that now. But there's something else, isn't there? Some final piece we haven't placed. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her expression remained serious. You feel it too, then? Craddock nodded. Yes. A slow, creeping realization settled over the room. Redfern's voice was quiet when he spoke. She's not finished, is she? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose to her feet, smoothing the folds of her dress. No, she said finally. I don't believe she is. Craddock cursed again, already rising from his chair. We need to make sure she doesn't have an escape route. Miss Marple glanced at him, a small, knowing smile playing at her lips. Oh, Inspector, she murmured. Alice doesn't need an escape. Craddock frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple turned toward the window. She's already won. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken understanding, because Alice had never intended to run. She had never intended to avoid justice. She had already written her ending exactly as she had wanted. Craddock's jaw tightened. Blast. It all. He grabbed his coat and hurried toward the door. Miss Marple remained where she was, watching the fire flicker in the dim room. Alice Redfern would go to prison. That much was certain. But the final triumph? That belonged to her alone. As the rain drizzled lightly against the manor's windows, Inspector Craddock stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, watching the flames shift and crackle. The night had stretched long, filled with confessions, accusations and revelations that had unraveled a carefully constructed illusion. Alice Redfern had been taken away, and Henry Redfern sat in stunned silence, grappling with the weight of his own fate. By all appearances, the case was closed, and yet something still gnawed at him. Miss Marple, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet in the past few minutes, finally spoke. It is a rather peculiar feeling, isn't it? Craddock turned to her, his frown deepening. What is? She smiled, though there was a distant quality to it. That moment when everything has seemingly fallen into place, yet something still feels just a little bit off. Craddock exhaled sharply, running a hand over his chin. So you feel it too? Miss Marple nodded. Oh, yes. The inspector began pacing, his boots making soft thuds against the carpet. Alice had a plan, we know that. She wanted Henry to take the fall, but she knew she wouldn't escape justice forever. That part makes sense. What doesn't make sense is, why now? Why let herself get caught when she had been careful for so long? Miss Marple tilted her head. A fascinating question indeed. Redfern let out a hollow laugh from where he sat. Does it matter? She's finished. The trial will take care of the rest. Miss Marple regarded him with something like sympathy. Oh, Mr. Redfern, I do wonder. Do you truly believe that? Redfern's smirk faltered slightly. Craddock sighed. Blast it. I thought this was done. He turned to Miss Marple. If you think we missed something, then say it plainly. Miss Marple looked toward the fire, as if considering her words carefully. It's not about what we missed, Inspector. It's about what we were meant to see. Craddock narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? She met his gaze. Alice was clever. Too clever to let things slip by accident. Every step she took, every move she made, was intentional. Craddock's frown deepened. You think she left something behind? Miss Marple sighed. I think she left us exactly what she wanted us to find. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, from somewhere in the hallway, there was a sound, a faint creak of a floorboard. Craddock stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. Who's there? A moment later, a housemaid appeared at the doorway, wringing her hands nervously. I'm sorry, sir. It's just that, well, I found something. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before nodding. What is it? The maid hesitated, then stepped forward, holding out a small envelope. It was in the library, tucked behind one of the books. Craddock took it, his pulse quickening as he flipped it over. Miss Marple peered at it as well. No name? Craddock carefully tore it open, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, precise. A single sentence was scrawled across it. The story isn't over. Miss Marple stared at the note, her expression unreadable. Craddock's grip tightened. Damn it all. Redfern, from his chair, chuckled softly.
You see, Inspector, she always was the smartest person in the room. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. What does this mean? Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the words, her mind already whirring through possibilities. Then at last,
she looked up. It means, dear Inspector, she said softly, that Alice Redfern may be behind bars. But she's not the only one we should be watching. Outside, the rain continued to fall, quiet and unrelenting. The case was over, and yet somehow it had only just begun.